He sold his own daughter for 4 hectares of vineyard. Before we begin this tragic story that took place in the hills of Burgundy in 1854, tell us in the comments where you're listening from right now. Are you comfortably seated at home, on your way somewhere? Wherever you are, this story will follow you to the end. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. Because, as Jean Du Roy learned the hard way, some decisions change a life forever, and we still have so many stories to tell you. Now sit back, because what you're about to hear will chill your blood. Autumn was slowly settling over Burgundy. The hills rolled beneath a pearl-gray sky, and the vineyards stretched as far as the eye could see, their leaves turning red. In this land where soil was worth more than honor, where a family's social standing was measured in hectares of vines, lived Jean Du Roy. At 47, Jean was a broad-shouldered man, his face tanned by the sun and his hands hardened by labor. He owned a respectable farm, 12 hectares of vines, a stone house with green shutters, well-kept barns, and a solid reputation among the farmers of the village of Vosny. But for Jean, it was never enough. Each evening, sitting by the fireplace, he would study the cadastral maps of the region, tracing the borders of his land with his finger, dreaming of expanding them. His wife, Marguerite, had died 3 years earlier of a fever, leaving him their only child, Elise, who had just turned 10. The girl was the spitting image of her mother, light brown hair she braided neatly every morning, gray-green eyes like the winter sea, and a natural gentleness that contrasted with her father's roughness. Elise spent her days tending the rose garden her mother had planted, playing the piano in the parlor, an old instrument Marguerite had insisted on keeping despite Jean's objections, and reading the few books the village priest lent her. She dreamed of a world beyond the hills, a world where women could choose their own destiny. That September morning, Elise went down to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. The house smelled of burning wood and fresh bread. Through the window, she watched the grape pickers already at work among the vines. Her father was outside, packing his land with that tense expression he'd worn so often lately. "Good morning, father," she said softly. When Jean finally came in, his muddy boots left traces across the stone floor. "Elise," he answered curtly without looking at her. He sat heavily at the table, his brow furrowed. "Make strong coffee. I've got a long day ahead." She obeyed in silence, pouring boiling water over the ground coffee. The atmosphere in the house had grown heavier since Marguerite's death. Jean spoke little, and when he did, it was to give orders or complain about the lack of workers, the price of wine, or the summer drought. "The Baron of Montrevel is coming this afternoon," Jean suddenly announced, breaking the silence. "Prepare the parlor. We have business to discuss." Elise felt a shiver run down her spine. The Baron of Montrevel was the wealthiest man in the region. His estate, the Château de Valmont, overlooked the valley, with 20 hectares of Burgundy's most prized vines. But the man had a dark reputation. At 50, he had buried 2 wives. The first died in childbirth, the second from a mysterious fall down the Château staircase. "Why is he coming here?" Elise asked, her voice slightly trembling. Jean finally looked up at her, and for the first time, Elise saw something in his eyes that resembled shame, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "That's none of your concern," he said coldly. "Just prepare the parlor and stay in your room. When he arrives." The rest of the morning passed in tense silence. Elise cleaned the parlor, dusted the furniture, and set out the finest glasses on the table. She didn't understand why her heart was pounding so hard, why a heavy sense of dread was taking over her. At exactly 3 o'clock, A black carriage drawn by two horses stopped in front of the house. The Baron de Montreville stepped down slowly, dressed in a dark suit that accentuated his imposing figure. His face was lined with age, deep wrinkles carved around his eyes and mouth. His graying hair was combed back neatly, and a thin mustache framed his upper lip. Jean greeted him with an unusual deference, shaking his hand with forced warmth. The two men disappeared into the parlor, and the door closed behind them. Elise went up to her room as ordered, but she couldn't help pressing her ear to the floorboards. The voices came through muffled but distinct. 4 hectares of your best vines plus the mill near the river, her father said. That's a fair price for what I'm offering you. The Baron's deep voice replied, Your daughter is young, I'll grant you that. But is she docile? My last wife had too much spirit, it caused problems. Elise felt her blood turn to ice. In a single, horrifying instant, she understood. Her father was negotiating her marriage, like one would bargain over the price of a horse or a plot of land. Elise is gentle and obedient, Jean replied without hesitation. She knows how to run a household. She plays the piano, she reads. She'll make a suitable wife, and she will accept this marriage. A pause, then more coldly, She'll do what I tell her to do. Elise clapped her hand over her mouth to stifle a sob. Her legs trembled. She wanted to run down, to scream, to beg, but she stayed frozen, paralyzed by fear and disbelief. The negotiations dragged on for nearly an hour. When she finally heard the parlor door open, she quickly lay down on her bed, pretending to read. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway, the Baron's, followed by the distant sound of the carriage rolling away. Moments later, her father came upstairs. He knocked once sharply. "Come in," she whispered, her voice broken. Jean entered, his face expressionless, unreadable. He remained standing by the door, hands in his pockets. "You will marry the Baron de Montreville in 6 weeks," he announced bluntly. "The engagement will be announced Sunday at church." Elise sat up abruptly, her book falling to the floor. "No, father, you can't. It's decided. But I don't love him, I don't even know him." Tears now streamed freely down her cheeks. "Father, please, love." Jean let out a dry laugh. "Your mother and I didn't love each other when we married, and yet we lived a decent life. You'll get used to it. He's twice your age. His wives are dead." "Village rumors," Jean said dismissively, waving his hand as if swatting away a fly. "The Baron is a respected man. You'll live in luxury. You'll have servants. You'll want for nothing." "I don't want servants," Elise whispered desperately. She struggled to find the words, "I want to be free to choose." Jean's face hardened. "You're a woman, you have no choice to make. I've arranged everything. Thanks to this marriage, I will have the vineyards I need. Our name will be respected." Elise then understood with painful clarity that she was nothing but a bargaining chip. Her father was selling her for land, for wealth, for his ambition. "Mother would never have forgiven you," she said, her voice trembling with rage and grief. Jean flinched but said nothing. He left the room, closing the door behind him. That night Elise cried until exhaustion overtook her. Through the window, she saw the vineyards stretching into the darkness, those same vineyards her father valued more than her happiness, more than her very life. The autumn wind swept over the hills, rustling the leaves of the vines. And somewhere within that sound, Elise thought she could hear her mother's voice, soft and sorrowful, like a funeral song. The 6 weeks that followed were the longest of Elise's life. Each day dragged endlessly, as if time itself resisted what was about to happen. Autumn had now settled completely, and the vineyards had turned a bronze hue before the fall of their leaves. The following Sunday, Jean and Elise went to the village church for the announcement of the engagement. The Baron de Montrevel was waiting in front of the porch, dressed in his black suit, a silver-handled cane in hand. When Elise stepped down from the carriage, he approached and kissed her hand. His lips were cold and damp. She suppressed a shudder of disgust. "Mademoiselle du Roy," he said in his deep voice, "you are even more charming than I remembered." Elise said nothing. She kept her eyes lowered, her hands clenched tightly around her missal. Beside her, her father beamed, shaking hands, receiving congratulations. No one seemed to notice, or perhaps they chose not to notice, Elise's silence, the pallor of her face, or the trembling of her lips. Inside the church, Father Bertrand made the announcement with solemn gravity. Jean du Roy and Baron de Montrevel are pleased to announce the engagement of Mademoiselle Elise du Roy and Baron Edouard de Montrevel. The wedding will be celebrated on October 28th in this very church. A murmur rippled through the congregation. Elise could feel the eyes upon her, some filled with pity, others with morbid curiosity. The women of the village knew the Baron's reputation. They knew what had happened to his previous wives, but no one would speak. In this world where men decided and women obeyed, silence was the only form of resistance allowed. After Mass, Madame Blanchard, the village baker, approached Elise as she waited for her father, who was still speaking with the Baron. "My dear child," she whispered, gently squeezing her hand, "if you ever need anything." Elise looked up at her. Madame Blanchard had been her mother's friend. In the older woman's eyes, Elise saw a mix of compassion and helplessness. What could she do? What could anyone do? "Thank you," Elise murmured softly before her father called her over with a sharp gesture. The following days were devoted to preparations. Jean hired a seamstress from the nearby town to make the wedding dress. Elise had to endure long hours of fittings, standing on a stool while pins were stuck and fabric adjusted around her. The dress was ivory satin, with long sleeves and a trailing hem, beautiful yet suffocating, like an ornate shroud. One evening, while Elise was alone in her room, she heard voices coming from her father's study. The window was slightly open, and the words carried clearly up to her. She recognized the voice of the notary, Master Dufer, who had come to draw up the marriage contract. "So, to recap," the notary was saying, "in exchange for your daughter's marriage to Baron de Montrevel, you will receive 4 hectares of vineyard on the Valmont hillside, the mill on the river Vouge, and an annual pension of 500 francs. "That's correct," Jean replied, and there was a barely contained satisfaction in his voice. "The Baron, in return, requires that Mademoiselle du Roy renounce all rights to her father's property upon his death. All assets will pass to the Baron." A pause, then Jean's voice, firm and cold, agreed. Elise felt her knees give way. Not only was her father selling her, he was also stripping her of any inheritance. She would own nothing, would be entirely dependent on the Baron. And if something happened to her, and she couldn't help but think of the Baron's 2 previous wives, she would have no recourse, no protection. She collapsed onto her bed, burying her face in her pillow to muffle her sobs. How much was she worth in the end? 4 hectares of vineyard, a mill, 500 francs a year. That was the price of her life. The weeks drifted by in a gray haze. Elise went through her daily tasks mechanically, cooking, cleaning, tending the garden, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought of running away, leaving in the night, taking the small savings she had managed to hide, catching a coach to Paris or Lyon. But where would she go? A young girl alone, unprotected, penniless. She knew what happened to women like that, the streets, poverty, or worse. One night 2 weeks before the wedding, Elise went down to the parlor. She couldn't sleep, and the thought of staying in her room listening to the wind was unbearable. She lit a candle and sat down at the piano. Her fingers found the keys in the dim light, and she began to play softly, a melancholy lullaby her mother had once taught her. It told the story of a young girl imprisoned in a tower. She didn't know how long she played. When she finally lifted her eyes, her father was standing in the doorway, a candle in his hand. His face was half hidden in shadow, unreadable. "You play well," he said after a long silence. Elise didn't answer. Her hands remained motionless on the keys. Jean stepped into the room, moving closer. "Your mother used to play that same melody," he murmured. "I know," Elise replied, her voice cold and distant. "Elise," he seemed to search for his words, something rare for him. "One day you'll understand. What I'm doing, it's for your own good, for our future." She turned toward him then, and in her gray-green eyes burned a cold fury he had never seen before. "My good," she said bitterly. "You're trading me for land, giving me to a man I don't know, don't love, a man who may have killed his previous wives, and you dare say it's for my good." "The rumors are just rumors," Jean replied defensively. "The Baron is a respectable man." "A respectable man?" Elise cut him off with a hollow laugh. "Does a respectable man buy a young girl as if she were cattle?" Jean said nothing. Then in a harder tone, "You are my daughter. You will obey me. In 8 days you'll be the Baron's wife, and that will be the end of it." "The end for you, perhaps," she whispered, rising to her feet. "But for me, it will only be the beginning." She brushed past him without another glance. As she climbed the stairs, she heard him murmur something, but she didn't stop. It was only later, in the silence of her room, that she realized what he had said. "Forgive me, but he—" It was too late for forgiveness. On October 27th, the eve of the wedding, the Baron invited Jean and Elise to the Château de Valmont for dinner. It was the first time Elise had set foot in the place that would soon become her home. The Château was imposing, with its stone towers and mullioned windows. Inside, everything was dark and cold. The corridors were lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. The furniture was old, massive, like the walls of a prison. The Baron greeted them in the grand salon. A fire burned in the immense fireplace, yet it failed to warm the icy atmosphere of the room. "Welcome to your future home, my dear," said the Baron, taking Elise's arm. His grip was firm, almost painful. "Tomorrow you will be the Baroness of Montrevel." Dinner was interminable. Elise barely ate, merely pushing the food around her plate. The two men talked business, vineyards, harvests, as if she didn't exist. She was nothing more than an object changing hands. After dinner, the Baron insisted on showing Elise around the Château. Jean remained in the salon, enjoying his future son-in-law's cognac. The Baron led Elise through the dim corridors, showing her the bedrooms, the library, the music room. "This will be your room," he said, opening a door on the first floor. The room was large but gloomy. A canopy bed stood in the center, draped in heavy burgundy velvet curtains. The windows overlooked the vineyards stretching all the way to the horizon. "You'll be happy here," continued the Baron, standing a little too close. "You'll be an obedient wife, won't you?" Elise stepped back slightly. "I will do my duty," she replied in a trembling voice. The Baron smiled, but his smile never reached his eyes. Good. My previous wives, they had trouble understanding their role. But you're young, you'll learn. He reached out and brushed her cheek with his hand. Elise froze, every muscle tense, fighting the urge to run. Until tomorrow, my future wife, he murmured before leaving her alone in the room. Elise remained motionless long after he had gone. Through the window, she watched the moon rise above the vineyards. In a few hours, the sun would rise on the day of her wedding, the day her life, as she knew it, would end. That night, back in her own room at the farm, Elise wept silently for the last time. She cried for the young girl she had once been, for the dreams she would never fulfill, and for the freedom she would never know. Never. And in the vineyards below, the wind blew softly, carrying with it the last remnants of her innocence. October 28th, 1854, dawned beneath a low, gray sky. Thick clouds blanketed Burgundy, and a fine rain began to fall over the hills. In the small church of Vosny, the villagers had already gathered, curious, silent, whispering among themselves about the wedding everyone had been murmuring about for weeks. Elise awoke in her room before sunrise. She had barely slept, drifting in and out of a restless slumber filled with nightmares. For a long moment she lay still, listening to the rain tapping against the window panes, wondering whether she should rise or simply remain there motionless until time itself stopped. But time never stops. At 8 o'clock, the seamstress arrived with two assistants to help her dress. Elise let them work as if she were a porcelain doll. They washed her, brushed her hair until it gleamed, then twisted it into an elaborate bun adorned with tiny white pearls. Then came the dress. The satin felt cold against her skin. It was slightly too large, hanging on her as if it had been made for someone else. When the seamstress finished and fixed the veil atop her head, Elise looked at herself in the mirror. She did not recognize the reflection that stared back. The young woman before her was pale as death, her eyes red but dry. There were no tears left. She looked like a ghost, an apparition in white who no longer belonged to the world of the living. "You are magnificent, mademoiselle," whispered the seamstress, though her voice lacked conviction. At 10 o'clock, Jean climbed the stairs to his daughter's room. He wore his best suit, his hair neatly combed back. For a moment he stood silently on the threshold, looking at her without speaking. "It's time," he finally said. Elise turned toward him. "Did you think of Mother today?" she asked in a flat, distant tone. Jean flinched. "Did you think about what she would feel if she saw you right now? If she knew what you're doing?" "Elise, don't start." "She loved you," Eliza's voice cracked slightly. "She trusted you. She believed you would protect me." Jean looked away. "Your mother would understand. She knew how the world works." "No," Elise shook her head slowly. "She wouldn't understand, and she would never forgive you." A heavy silence settled between them. Then Jean stepped closer and held out his arm. "Come, we're expected." Elise did not take his arm. She descended the staircase alone, the train of her gown sliding behind her along the wooden steps. Outside, the rain was falling harder now. The carriage that was to take them to the church waited at the gate, its wheels sinking slightly into the mud. The church awaited, the coachman standing by with an umbrella to shield them from the rain. The ride to the church was silent. Jean stared out the window, carefully avoiding his daughter's gaze. Elise kept her hands clasped tightly on her knees, squeezing them so hard her knuckles turned white. The church was full when they arrived. All the local notables were present, along with the farmers and servants. The organ played a solemn tune that echoed under the stone vaults. Candles burned despite the daylight, casting dancing shadows along the walls. The Baron de Montrevel stood before the altar, dressed in a flawless black suit. Beside him was his witness, a notary from Dijon whom no one knew. When Elise appeared at the back of the church, every head turned toward her. She walked slowly down the central aisle, her father at her side, and felt as though she were walking to the gallows. Father Bertrand waited for them, his Bible open. His face was grave, almost sorrowful. He too knew of the Baron's reputation. He too had heard the rumors. But what could he do? He was only a village priest, powerless against the will of powerful men. The ceremony began. The priest's words echoed through the church, but Elise barely heard them. Her mind was elsewhere, somewhere far away, where none of this was real. She thought of her mother, wondering if she was watching from above, if she was weeping for her. Edouard de Montrevel, do you take Elise du Roy, here present, to be your lawful wife? Yes, I do. The Baron's voice was firm and confident. Elise du Roy, do you take Edouard de Montrevel, here present, to be your lawful husband? Silence stretched across the church. Elise could feel every pair of eyes fixed upon her. The priest repeated the question. Beside her, she heard her father whisper through clenched teeth, Elise. She lifted her eyes toward the Baron. He looked at her with an unreadable expression, somewhere between satisfaction and warning. Then she turned to her father. Jean's face was flushed red, his jaw tight. In his eyes she saw no love, no compassion, only anger and fear that his carefully laid plan might crumble before him. It was at that moment that Elise understood. She was utterly alone. No one would come to her rescue. No one would pull her away from that altar. If she refused, her father would disown her. She would be left without a family, without a home. She would never see again. It was too late for escape now. Without resources, the Baron could sue her for breach of contract. She would be disgraced, ruined. She had no choice. In truth, she had never had a choice. Yes, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I do. The priest closed his eyes briefly, as if offering a silent prayer, then continued the ceremony. The rings were exchanged. The Baron slipped a gold band onto her finger. It was cold and heavy, like a shackle. I now pronounce you husband and wife. It was over. The Baron leaned forward and pressed a quick kiss against Elise's lips. His mouth was dry, devoid of warmth. Then he took her arm and led her toward the church doors. Outside, the rain had intensified. Guests huddled beneath the porch, offering their congratulations, but their voices sounded distant, muffled, as though coming from another world. Elise saw her father shake hands with the Baron. Both men were smiling, satisfied. The deal was done. The wedding feast was held at Château de Valmont. A long table had been laid in the grand dining hall, adorned with white flowers and flickering candles. The finest Burgundy wines flowed freely. Platters of food followed one after another, terrines, roasted meats, cheeses, pastries. Elise sat at the place of honor beside her husband. She barely touched her food. The Baron, on the other hand, ate heartily, laughing with his guests and boasting about his vineyards and travels. From time to time, he would place his hand over hers, a possessive gesture that made her shiver. Jean sat farther down the table, his face flushed with wine. He drank cup after cup, never once meeting his daughter's eyes. At one point, Madame Blanchard approached Elise and whispered softly, "Be brave, my dear." But courage was useless now. Courage couldn't undo what had been done. When the feast finally ended, the guests began to leave. Outside, the rain drummed against the castle windows. Jean was among the last to depart. He approached Elise, hesitated, then kissed her quickly on the forehead. "Be happy," he said. The words rang hollow, empty of all meaning. Elise didn't answer. She watched her father disappear into the rain-soaked night and knew she might never see him again. Perhaps she didn't want to. When all the guests had gone, the Baron took Elise by the hand and led her upstairs. They walked through the dark corridors to the chamber she had seen on her first visit. A single candle burned on the bedside table, casting trembling shadows across the walls. "You are my wife now," the Baron said, closing the door behind them, "and you will obey me in all things." Elise stood motionless by the window, watching the rain stream down the glass. Far in the distance, she could still see the faint lights of her father's farmhouse, weak, flickering, barely visible through the storm. She thought of her room, her piano, her books, her mother's rose garden, everything she had lost, everything she would never touch again. What she had lost. That night, Elise du Roy ceased to exist. In her place remained the Baroness de Montrevel, a silent shadow in a cold castle. And in the night, mingled with the sound of rain, one might have heard a muffled cry. But no one came, and no one ever would. The weeks following the wedding were, for Elise, like a long nightmare from which she could not awaken. The Château de Vaillemont had become her gilded prison, and the Baron de Montrevel her jailer. In the first days, Elise still hoped that perhaps, with time, things would get better, that the Baron might become gentler, more understanding. But that hope vanished quickly. The Baron was a demanding and temperamental man. He wanted Elise to be present at every meal, elegantly dressed, perfectly coiffed, smiling. She was to supervise the servants, organize receptions when he invited business associates, and play the piano for his guests. She was to be the perfect wife, the ornament of his success, but above all, she was to be silent. "A respectable woman does not give her opinion," he often repeated to her. "She listens, she smiles, she obeys." The castle's servants, an elderly cook named Madame Gerard, two maids and a butler, looked upon Elise with pity. They had known the previous wives. They knew how it always ended. One November morning, while fog wrapped itself around the vineyards, Madame Gerard climbed to Elise's room under the pretense of bringing her breakfast. The young woman sat by the window, staring out at the gray landscape without truly seeing it. "Madame la Baronne," murmured the cook as she set down the tray, "may I speak frankly with you?" Elise turned her empty gaze toward her. "Speak, but be careful." Madame Gerard glanced toward the door, making sure they were alone. "The Baron, he has his moods. When he drinks, when business goes poorly." "I know," Elise interrupted softly. She had already witnessed his moods, the sudden fits of rage, the objects hurled against the walls, the cruel words spat like venom. "The first Madame de Montrevel," the old woman hesitated. "She was gentle like you. She died in childbirth." "Yes, but—" Elise pressed when Madame Gerard stopped, as if wrestling with herself. "The baby was born dead, and she had bruises on her arms, on her neck. The doctor said it was from the fall when her waters broke, but—" Madame Gerard shook her head slowly. "We knew, we all knew." Elise felt her blood run cold. "And the second wife, Madame Hailing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. A shadow of sorrow passed over the cook's face. "She was strong." She stood up to the Baron. She answered him back, refused to stay silent. "One night there was a terrible quarrel. You could hear the shouting all the way from the kitchens. The next morning they found her at the foot of the grand staircase. The Baron said she had fallen in the dark. Madame Gerard paused meaningfully. But Madame Haley knew this shade out by heart. She would never have mistaken her way in the dark. Elise raised a trembling hand to her throat. "Why are you telling me this?" "So that you know, so that you'll be careful." Madame Gerard took Elise's hand and squeezed it gently. "Never defy him, never answer back. Make yourself small, invisible. It's the only way to survive." She left the room quickly, leaving Elise alone with her terrifying thoughts. That night the Baron came home late from a meeting in Beaune. He had been drinking. Elise sensed it the moment he entered their bedroom, the air thick with the smell of wine and tobacco. "Elise," he slurred, "play me something on the piano." It was past midnight. Elise was in her nightgown, ready for bed. "It's late, my husband, perhaps tomorrow." The slap came without warning. She fell back onto the bed, her cheek burning, ears ringing. "When I ask you for something, you obey," the Baron said, his voice suddenly cold, sobered by anger. "Do you understand me?" Elise rose slowly, trembling. "Yes, forgive me." She went down to the drawing room, barefoot on the cold stone floor, and sat at the piano. Her fingers shook on the keys. She began to play a simple, mechanical melody. The Baron slumped into an armchair, a glass of cognac in hand, watching her through half-closed eyes. She played for an hour. When she finally stopped, the Baron was snoring in his chair. Elise crept silently back to the bedroom and locked the door. She stayed awake the rest of the night, her hand on her swollen cheek, listening to the sounds of the shade now. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Winter came, covering the vineyards in frost. Elise rarely left the shade now, the Baron forbade it. "You have no reason to go to the village," he would say. "Everything you need is here." She grew pale, almost translucent. She ate little, spoke even less. The servants saw her gliding through the corridors, a ghost in long dresses. Sometimes at night they heard the piano, always the same sad, melancholic melody, played over and over until dawn. One day in December, while a snowstorm raged over the region, Jean du Roy came to visit his daughter. It was the first time he had come since the wedding. Since the wedding, Jean had not visited the castle. The Baron received him warmly, offering his best wine and chatting about the vineyards and the upcoming harvest. Thanks to the marriage, Jean had prospered. His new lands produced an excellent wine. He had hired more workers, expanded his cellar. He was now a respected man in the region. "And how is my daughter?" he finally asked, almost as an afterthought. "Elise is doing wonderfully," replied the Baron with a smile. "Isn't that right, my dear?" Elise was sitting silently in a corner of the salon. She raised her eyes toward her father. Jean truly looked at her for the first time since his arrival, and what he saw made him shudder. His daughter had grown thin. Her cheeks were hollow, her eyes shadowed. She wore a dark dress that seemed to swallow her whole, and on her neck, half hidden by a lace collar, he caught sight of a bruised mark. "Elise," he exclaimed, his voice suddenly uncertain. "I am well, father," she answered in a neutral, emotionless tone. "As you can see, I lack nothing." There was something in her voice, a coldness, a distance, that made Jean understand he had lost his daughter, not just physically but entirely. She looked at him as one looks at a stranger, or worse, an enemy. "The vines you gave me are yielding well, aren't they?" she asked next, and every word was like a stab to the heart. Jean paled. "Are you satisfied with your transaction, father?" she continued. "Did I fetch a good enough price?" The Baron laughed, thinking she was joking, but Jean knew she was not. He saw in his daughter's eyes all the bitterness, all the betrayal she carried within her. He left soon after, pretending the storm was worsening. In the carriage that carried him home through the snow, Jean thought about what he had seen, the marks on his daughter's neck, her thinness, her empty gaze. For the first time since the marriage, Jean Duroy felt something that resembled remorse. But it was too late, far too late. At the chateau, Elise returned to her room. She sat by the window and watched the snow fall. Somewhere in that storm, her father was riding away, the man who had sold her for a few hectares of vineyard, the man she had once loved and respected. She did not cry, she had no tears left. There remained within her only an immense emptiness, cold as the winter that spread over Burgundy. That night the wind howled around the castle, and in that howled one might have heard a soft, sorrowful voice singing a lullaby. But perhaps it was only the wind. Or perhaps it was the soul of Elise Duroy, slowly escaping her body, searching for a freedom she would never find in life. Spring came to Burgundy, carrying its promise of renewal, but at the Château de Valmont nothing changed. The days followed one another, identical, heavy, and suffocating. Elise had become a shadow of herself, a ghost haunting the dark corridors, mechanically obeying the Baron's orders, surviving more than living. March brought the first green shoots to the vineyards. Workers returned to the fields, pruning the vines, preparing the soil. From her bedroom window, Elise sometimes watched them with quiet envy. They at least could leave at the end of the day, go home, live their lives. The Baron grew even more demanding with the arrival of spring. It was the season of business, of negotiations and receptions. He often invited wine buyers, landowners, and other local notables. Elise was expected to be present, the perfect wife, smiling, elegant, silent. But beneath the polished veneer of respectability, the violence continued. On nights when the Baron drank too much, when business went poorly, or when something displeased him, he turned to Elise. Sometimes it was with cruel words, humiliation. Sometimes it was worse. Elise learned to anticipate his moods, to make herself invisible when he was angry, to answer exactly what he wanted to hear. She became an expert in the art of survival. As Madame Gerard had once advised her, she made herself small, discreet, obedient, but something inside her was dying a little more each day. One evening in April, as a thunderstorm broke over the region, the Baron hosted a grand reception to celebrate an important wine contract. About 20 guests filled the salon, their laughter and noisy chatter echoing through the halls. Elise moved among them in a green silk gown, serving wine and exchanging polite words. It was then she noticed a man she had never seen before, a young doctor from Beaune named Dr. Laurent Mercier. He was different from the other men there. He did not have that hard, calculating gaze of landowners. When their eyes met briefly, she saw something she hadn't seen in years, compassion. Later in the evening, as she stood near the window to escape the noise, Dr. Mercier approached her. "Madame de Montrevel," he said politely, "you seem tired, perhaps you should rest." Elise was taken aback that he noticed. No one ever noticed. Or if they did noticed, he always looked away. "I'm fine, doctor," she replied with her automatic smile. "It's just the warmth of the room." He studied her, and Elise had the unpleasant feeling that he could see through her lie, that he noticed the dark circles beneath her eyes, the thinness of her wrists, the sorrow she tried so desperately to hide. "If you ever need medical care," he said softly, "don't hesitate to send for me. My practice is in bone." Before Elise could answer, the Baron's voice thundered from across the room. "Elise, come and play for our guests." She excused herself from the doctor and walked to the piano. Her fingers found the keys and she began to play. But that night, instead of the usual polished melodies, she chose something different, a piece her mother had once taught her, filled with melancholy and longing, a melody that spoke of lost freedom. When she finished, there was silence, then polite applause. The Baron looked at her with a strange expression, as if something had just dawned on him. That night, after the guests had left, he came up to their bedroom where Elise was preparing for bed. "You played differently tonight," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "I thought our guests would appreciate something new," Elise replied cautiously. "That Dr. Mercier, you spoke with him for quite some time." "For only a few moments," she answered quietly. "He was concerned about my health." The Baron stepped closer. "Your health is my concern. You don't need a doctor. You don't need to speak to anyone but me. Do you understand?" "Yes." "And you will not play that piece again. I didn't like it." Elise lowered her gaze. "As you wish." But something had awakened inside her that night. The fact that Dr. Mercier had noticed her, had seen her pain, reminded her that she was still alive, that she wasn't entirely dead inside. In the weeks that followed, Elise began to think of escape. She knew it was nearly impossible. She had no money, no family who would help her, nowhere to go. But the thought was there, buried deep like a fragile seed. Then in early May, something happened that changed everything. Jean Duroy fell ill. At first it seemed minor, a lingering cough, a bit of fever, but his condition worsened rapidly. Within weeks, the once strong farmer became frail, bedridden and weak. Had once guided her when she was a child, the same hand that had taught her to hold a quill, to plant a seed, but also the same hand that had signed away her life. The Dr. Mercier had been called. He diagnosed a severe lung infection. Jean needed constant care, expensive medicine, but above all, he needed someone to look after him. His workers could manage the vineyard, but they could not nurse him. When the Baron learned of the news, a satisfied smile crossed his face. "Let justice be done," he murmured. "Let him suffer as he made others suffer." But Elise, despite everything, despite the betrayal, could not ignore that her father was dying. Part of her hated him, but another part, the part that remembered the man he had been before her mother's death, before greed consumed him, felt pity. "I want to go see him," she said one evening to the Baron. "No. He's my father, he's dying." "He sold you for vineyards," the Baron replied coldly. "He doesn't deserve your compassion." "Perhaps not," Elise admitted quietly, "but I am not him and I am not you." The Baron stared at her for a long time. Then, to her surprise, he nodded. "Very well, you may go, but not alone. I will accompany you, and will stay for an hour, no more." The next morning, they traveled to the Duroy farm. The place looked neglected. The roses in the garden, the ones Elise had once loved, were overrun with weeds. The house itself seemed smaller, darker than she remembered. Jean lay bedridden in his chamber. When Elise entered, she was struck by the sight before her. Her father was a ghost of the man he once was, thin, pale, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets. He coughed constantly, a harsh, painful sound. "Elise," he whispered when he saw her. She sat by the bed, keeping her distance. The Baron stood near the door, silently watching. "How do you feel?" she asked in a neutral tone. "I'm dying." Jean gave a bitter laugh that dissolved into a fit of coughing. "The doctor says I have a few weeks, maybe a month." There was silence. Then weakly he said, "The vines are growing well this year." Elise didn't reply. "I know what you're thinking," Jean continued, his voice trembling. "That this is my punishment, that I deserve it." "Yes," Elise said simply, "you do." Jean closed his eyes. Tears rolled down his hollow cheeks. "You're right," he murmured. "I traded my daughter for land. I betrayed your mother. I betrayed you. I thought wealth could erase all pain, that owning more land would make me happy." He opened his eyes again, looking at her with desperate intensity. "But every night I drink the wine from those vines, and it tastes bitter, so bitter. And I see your face. I hear you playing the piano. Your mother haunts my dreams, staring at me with disgust." "Good," Eli said coldly. "I hope she haunts you until your final breath." Eli's eye. He stretched out a trembling hand toward her. "Forgive me, please. I can't die without your forgiveness." Elise looked at that hand, the hand that once guided hers as a child, and the same that had signed her away like property. The same hand that had once held hers at her mother's funeral, the same hand that had signed the contract selling her away. She did not take it. "You want my forgiveness," she said coldly, "so that you can die with a clear conscience." Her voice was hard, stripped of pity. "So that you can die in peace. But I, Father, I have no peace. I live in a nightmare every single day. You condemned me to a life of suffering just to satisfy your ambition. And now you want me to ease your guilt." "I know I don't deserve it," he whispered weakly. "No," Elise said, her tone sharp as a blade. "You don't." She rose to her feet. "You will die alone, Father, as you deserve. And your precious vineyards will keep growing, but they will be watered by your blood, by my suffering, by your betrayal. And every drop of wine they produce will taste of your sins." Without another word, she turned and left the room. The Baron followed, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. In the carriage back to the Shadow, Elise remained silent. She felt no satisfaction, no sorrow, only an immense emptiness. Jean Du Roy died 3 weeks later, one June evening as the sun set over the golden vineyards. He died alone in his bed, clutching in his trembling hand a letter he had written to his daughter, a letter she would never read, for the priest burned it after his death. Elise did not attend the funeral. The Baron forbade her, and this time she did not protest. She stayed at the Shadow, sitting by her window, staring toward the distant hills where her father's farm lay. The villagers noticed that even on the warmest summer evenings, the windows of Chateau Valemont remained closed, and the young Baroness was never seen in the village again. Some said she had gone mad with grief. Others whispered she was being held prisoner. But the truth was far simpler and far more terrible. Elise Du Roy had ceased to exist the day she was married. In her place remained a ghost, a shadow, a nameless woman haunting a cold, silent castle. The years passed. The Baron grew old, but his cruelty never faded. Elise aged too, growing paler, quieter, more hollow with each passing season. She almost never played the piano anymore. When she did, it was always the same melody, the one her mother had taught her, the one that spoke of lost freedom and forgotten love. Freedom. The servants came and went, but the story remained the same. They looked at the young Baroness with pity, knowing there was nothing they could do. Madame Girard retired, replaced by a younger cook who quickly learned to avert her eyes whenever she saw the marks on the Baroness's arms. One autumn, no one could say exactly which year, for the years had all begun to blur together, the villagers began to hear something strange. On nights when the wind swept through the vineyards, when the leaves fell and the mist settled over the hills, a voice could be heard, a woman's voice, soft and sorrowful, singing. It seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, from the Baron's vineyards, from those that had once belonged to Jean du Roy, from all those acres that had been the price of a life. The song was always the same, a melancholic lullaby, heavy with nostalgia and grief. Some said it was the ghost of Elise, though she was still alive. Others whispered it was the soul of her mother, weeping for her lost daughter. But perhaps it was only the wind, carrying the echoes of a tragedy no one had been able to prevent, the memory of a young girl sold for vineyards, traded for acres of land, sacrificed on the altar of a man's ambition. And each autumn, when the leaves fell and the new wine was pressed, the villagers remembered the story of the farmer's daughter. They told it in hushed voices within the safety of their homes, as a warning. For the wine from Jean du Roy's vineyards, those vineyards he had so desperately desired, had a peculiar taste. Connoisseurs claimed it was excellent, perfectly balanced. But those who knew the story swore it carried a bitter aftertaste. The taste of regret, the taste of betrayal, the taste of a young girl's tears, whose life had been the price of a diabolical pact. At the Château de Vaillemont, the windows remained closed. The Baroness de Montrevel went on living, if one could call it living, in silence and solitude. And sometimes, very rarely, when the night was particularly dark and the Baron was asleep, she would go down to the salon and play the piano. Always the same melody, again and again, until the first light of dawn came to remind her that a new day had begun, identical to the one before, identical to the one that would follow. A life without end, a prison without bars, a sacrifice that would never be redeemed. And in the vineyards below, the wind kept blowing, carrying with it the song of a lost soul, the memory of a father who sold his daughter, and the echo of a mother's love that could never save her. Thus ended the sorrowful tale of the farmer who traded his own daughter for land, without resolution, without justice, without hope. Only the wind, the vineyards, and the eternal silence of a woman whose voice had been stolen along with her freedom. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect on the price of ambition and the sacrifices some are willing to make at the expense of others, take a moment to leave a comment. Tell us what you thought, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our stories. Because the story of Elise du Rio is not just a tale from the past. It's a reminder that even in our modern world, there are still those who are treated as bargaining chips, that ambition can still destroy lives, and that the silence of witnesses is just as guilty as the cruelty of the perpetrators. The vineyards of Burgundy still produce their wine today. And if you ever visit this beautiful region, if you ever taste its exquisite wines, remember that centuries ago, a young girl paid the ultimate price so that these lands could change hands. Her name was Elise du Roy. She was 17 years old, and she deserved far more than the fate that was forced upon her. May her story never be forgotten.